I was just a villager in Judea, a simple man trying to survive under Roman rule. Every day was the same: dusty streets, endless labor, the sting of oppression. Life was predictable until I saw something I was never meant to see. The sun beat down mercilessly on our village that morning, same as it had for countless days before. I worked the fields with calloused hands, sweat dripping onto the parched earth beneath my feet. The Romans demanded their taxes, the Pharisees demanded their tithes, and we common folk were left with barely enough to feed our families. This was existence, not living. This was survival, not hope. Yet something stirred within me, a restlessness I couldn't name, a hunger that had nothing to do with the empty ache in my stomach. I had heard whispers in the marketplace, stories carried by travelers from distant towns. They spoke of a man from Nazareth, a teacher who spoke with authority unlike the scribes, who healed the sick with a touch, who fed thousands with mere fragments of bread and fish. Some called him a prophet, others whispered he might be the Messiah, the one we had waited for, the one our fathers and their fathers before them had longed to see. But I was a practical man, hardened by years of disappointment and broken promises. False messiahs had come before, leading people to ruin, stirring up hope only to crush it beneath the weight of reality. Why should this Jesus be any different? Yet the stories persisted, growing bolder with each telling. The blind could see, the lame walked, demons fled at his command. Either this man was the greatest deceiver who ever lived, or he was exactly who the whispers claimed him to be. My wife would catch me staring off into the distance as I considered these things, lost in thoughts that felt too large for my simple mind to contain. She would ask what troubled me, and I could never find the words. How do you explain the feeling that the world is about to change, that everything you thought you knew is about to be turned upside down? How do you voice the fear that maybe, just maybe, God is moving again after centuries of silence? The night before everything changed, I couldn't sleep. I walked outside our small stone house and looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched over Abraham, Moses, and David. I wondered if they had ever felt this anticipation, this mixture of hope and terror that comes when you sense the divine drawing near. The air itself seemed to hum with possibility, and I found myself whispering prayers I hadn't spoken since childhood, asking questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. When morning came, I made a decision that would alter the course of my life forever. Instead of heading to the fields, I would seek out this Jesus of Nazareth. I had to see for myself whether the stories were true, whether this man carried within him the power to change not just individual lives, but the very fabric of history itself. I told my wife I would be gone for several days, that I needed to find answers to questions that were eating away at my soul like cancer. She looked into my eyes and saw something there that made her nod without argument. She packed me bread and water, kissed my forehead, and whispered a prayer for my safe return. As I walked away from everything familiar, every step taking me further from the life I knew, I felt both terrified and more alive than I had in years. The road stretched before me, dusty and uncertain, but for the first time in my adult life, I was walking towards something rather than merely enduring what each day might bring. I didn't know then that I was about to witness a confrontation that would echo through eternity, a battle fought not with swords and shields, but with words that carried the power to reshape reality itself. I didn't know that in seeking answers about this mysterious teacher, I would become an eyewitness to the moment when the very forces of darkness would throw everything they had at the Son of God, and I would watch to see whether he would stand or fall under the weight of temptation that no man before him had ever resisted. Like many in our oppressed land, I longed for freedom, with an ache that never left my chest. Some hoped Rome would fall, dreaming of rebellion and uprising, of driving out the occupiers who taxed us into poverty and treated us like animals. Others prayed desperately for the Messiah, the promised one who would restore the kingdom to Israel and establish justice in a world gone mad with cruelty and corruption. I wasn't sure what to believe about politics or prophecy, but something deep inside me whispered that the answers we sought weren't to be found in Roman palaces or rebel camps, but in the man I had started following, Jesus of Nazareth. The journey to find him took me through territories I had never seen, past olive groves and vineyards that belonged to wealthy landowners who had never known hunger, through valleys where shepherds watched their flocks and told stories of angels appearing to announce the birth of a special child some 30 years ago. With each mile I traveled, the stories grew more remarkable and the evidence more compelling that this was no ordinary rabbi or teacher. Merchants spoke of wine that appeared from water at a wedding feast. Fishermen described nets breaking under the weight of miraculous catches. Mothers wept as they told of children healed from fever and disease that should have been death sentences. Yet it wasn't just the miracles that drew people to him, it was something deeper, something that touched the part of the human soul that recognizes truth when it hears it, even when that truth challenges everything we thought we knew about how the world works. When I finally caught up with the growing crowd that followed Jesus, I understood immediately why people left everything to walk beside him. There was something in his presence that made you want to be better than you were. Something in his voice that made even the simplest words sound like they contained secrets of the universe. He spoke about the kingdom of heaven not as a distant dream, but as a reality that was breaking into our world right now, transforming hearts and minds and relationships in ways that defied explanation. He talked about love as a force more powerful than armies, about forgiveness as a weapon that could defeat the darkness, about faith as small as a mustard seed moving mountains that seemed immovable. For days I walked with this ragtag band of disciples and followers, listening to teaching that turned conventional wisdom on its head, watching miracles that made me question everything I thought I knew about the limitations of human existence. I saw him heal a man who had been born blind, not just giving him physical sight, but opening his eyes to spiritual realities that transformed his entire understanding of who God was and how he worked in the world. I watched him face down religious leaders who tried to trap him with clever questions, only to have their own words turned back on them with wisdom that left them speechless and exposed. There were moments when the very air around him seemed to shimmer with power, when his words carried weight that pressed against your chest and made your heart race with the recognition that you were in the presence of someone who existed on a different plane entirely. Yet he was also unmistakably human, getting tired from long days of travel, feeling hunger and thirst, showing compassion that brought tears to his eyes when he saw suffering that others had learned to ignore. This combination of divine authority and human tenderness created a magnetism that drew people from every walk of life, from wealthy tax collectors to desperate prostitutes, from learned scribes to illiterate fishermen. But it was what I witnessed in the wilderness that convinced me beyond any doubt that the whispers were true, that this man was exactly who he claimed to be, that the kingdom of God had indeed come near in ways that would shake the foundations of heaven and earth. I followed him one morning, as he walked away from the crowds, away from the disciples who hung on his every word, away from the constant press of people seeking healing, answers, miracles, hope. He moved with purpose toward the wilderness, that harsh landscape of stone and sand where prophets had always gone to hear the voice of God more clearly, where the distractions of human civilization fell away and left only the essential questions of existence. The sun was already climbing toward its merciless peak as I watched him from a distance, careful to remain hidden behind rocks and sparse vegetation, sensing somehow that what was about to unfold was too sacred and too dangerous for ordinary human eyes. He had been fasting for 40 days, his body weakened by hunger, his clothes hanging loose on his frame, yet his eyes burned with something eternal, something that seemed to draw its strength not from bread or water, but from some inexhaustible source that flowed from the heart of the Creator himself. I could feel the weight of spiritual forces gathering in that desolate place, the air growing thick with tension that made the hair on my arms stand up, and my heart pound against my ribs like a trapped bird, desperate for escape. The very rocks seemed to hold their breath, the wind fell silent, and even the insects stopped their constant buzzing as if all creation was preparing to witness something that would determine the fate of humanity itself. That's when I felt it, a presence that made every nerve in my body scream in terror, a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow light itself, a malevolence so pure and concentrated that my knees buckled and I had to grip the stone beside me to keep from falling. The air shimmered like heat waves but cold instead of warm, and from that distortion stepped a figure that my mind struggled to comprehend. This was not the horned and cloven-hoofed creature of children's nightmares, but something far more terrifying because it was beautiful, charismatic, clothed in dark majesty that spoke of power and authority that predated the foundations of the world. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of millennia, smooth as honey but laced with venom that promised everything while delivering only destruction. I realized I was looking at the great deceiver himself, the father of lies, the one who had whispered temptation into the ear of Eve and had been working ever since to corrupt and destroy everything God had created. He had come for Jesus, and I understood with crystal clarity that this was the moment everything would be decided, that the fate of every human soul hung in the balance of what would happen in this God-forsaken stretch of desert. My throat constricted with fear so intense I could barely breathe, my hands shook uncontrollably, and part of me wanted to flee back to my village and pretend I had never seen this confrontation between light and darkness, between the Son of God and the Prince of Demons. But I was frozen in place, unable to move, compelled to witness this cosmic battle that would echo through eternity and determine whether hope or despair would have the final word in the story of humanity. The first words from Satan's lips were deceptively simple, almost conversational, yet they carried within them the weight of every temptation that had ever led humanity astray. His voice was like silk wrapped around a blade, beautiful and deadly, offering what seemed like reasonable solutions to pressing problems. "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread," he said, gesturing to the rocks scattered around Jesus' feet, and the logic seemed unassailable. Here was a man weakened by 40 days without food, his body crying out for nourishment, surrounded by stones that could be transformed into bread by a single word from his lips. What harm could there be in satisfying basic human needs, in using divine power to address the most fundamental requirement for survival? The temptation wasn't just about hunger, though that was certainly part of it, but about something far deeper and more dangerous. It was an invitation to use the power of God for personal comfort, to prioritize physical needs over spiritual purpose, to prove divinity through spectacle rather than sacrifice. I found myself holding my breath, my heart racing with anticipation and dread, because I knew that any ordinary man, no matter how spiritual or dedicated, would surely give in to such a reasonable request. Who among us, faced with starvation and possessing the power to create food, would choose to remain hungry? Yet as I watched Jesus, weakened though he was by weeks of fasting, I saw something in his bearing that spoke of strength that had nothing to do with physical nourishment, an authority that drew its power from sources that superseded the basic needs of the flesh. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried the weight of absolute certainty, each word measured and precise, cutting through Satan's smooth reasoning like a sword through silk. "Man shall not live on bread alone," he said, "but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." In that moment, I understood that this was not just a response to temptation, but a declaration of war, a statement that the Son of God would not be moved from his mission by appeals to comfort, convenience, or even basic survival. The power that could turn stones to bread was the same power that had spoken the universe into existence, and it would not be used to shortcut the path of suffering that lay before him, would not be prostituted to serve desires that, however legitimate they might seem, would ultimately serve the enemy's purposes rather than the Father's plan. I felt something shift in the spiritual atmosphere around us, as if the first blow had been struck in a battle that had been building since the foundation of the world, and Satan had discovered that his opponent would not be as easily defeated as every other son of Adam who had faced similar tests. The confidence that had radiated from the great deceiver seemed to waver slightly, though his resolve remained unshaken, and I sensed that this was only the opening gambit in a confrontation that would escalate in ways that would test not just the limits of divine power, but the very nature of what it meant to be both fully God and fully human in a world corrupted by sin and rebellion. Satan's second attempt was more audacious than the first, a dramatic escalation that revealed both his desperation and his cunning. In an instant that defied the laws of physics and geography, he transported Jesus from the wilderness to the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem, the highest point of the most sacred building in all of Israel, a place where the faithful came to worship and offer sacrifices, where the presence of God was said to dwell among his people. From this dizzying height, the entire city spread out below like a map, the streets and buildings and courtyards filled with people who had no idea that high above them, the fate of the world was being decided in a confrontation between the Son of God and the Prince of Darkness. The wind whipped around them at that impossible height, yet neither figure seemed affected by the physical danger of their position, as if they existed in a realm where normal rules of safety and survival held no meaning. Satan's voice took on a new quality here, more theatrical, more manipulative, quoting scripture with the skill of a learned rabbi, twisting the word of God to serve his own purposes in a display of biblical knowledge that would have impressed the most educated scribes and Pharisees. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written that he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone." The temptation was breathtakingly sophisticated, using God's own promises as weapons against his Son, appealing not just to physical safety, but to the deeper human need to test God's faithfulness, to demand proof of divine love and protection through dramatic gestures that would remove all doubt and uncertainty from the relationship between Creator and creation. I found myself imagining the scene that would unfold if Jesus took Satan's advice. The gasps of amazement from the crowds below as they saw a figure leap from the temple's highest point only to be caught by invisible hands and lowered gently to the ground, the instant conviction that would follow such an undeniable miracle, the way such a spectacle would eliminate the need for faith by replacing it with indisputable evidence. Yet even as these thoughts raced through my mind, I realized that this was exactly what made the temptation so insidious, so perfectly crafted to appeal to human logic, while completely missing the point of why the Son of God had come to earth in the first place. Jesus stood unshaken on that precarious perch, his response cutting through Satan's scriptural manipulation with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test," he said. And in those words I heard the voice of one who understood that true faith cannot be built on the foundation of dramatic proofs and spectacular demonstrations, that the relationship between God and humanity must be grounded in trust, rather than in the demand for divine performance on human terms. The temple below represented everything that religion had become in the hands of fallen humanity, a system of rules and rituals and requirements that had lost sight of the heart of the God it claimed to serve, and Jesus would not use it as a stage for the kind of theatrical display that would reduce the sacred to the level of entertainment. The final temptation was the most brazen of all, a direct assault on the very purpose for which Jesus had come to earth, an offer that laid bare the true nature of the cosmic conflict that had been raging since the beginning of time. With a gesture that seemed to tear open the fabric of reality itself, Satan revealed the kingdoms of the world in all their glory, not just the small territories of Palestine or even the vast Roman Empire, but every nation and empire that had ever existed or would exist, all the wealth and power and dominion that humanity had fought over since Cain killed Abel, spread out like a feast before hungry eyes. The vision was overwhelming in its scope and breathtaking in its detail, armies marching in perfect formation, treasures that glittered with the accumulated wealth of nations, crowns and thrones and scepters that represented the ultimate earthly authority, all of it offered as a gift to the Son of God if only he would bend the knee to the prince of this world. "All this I will give you," Satan said, "if you bow down and worship me." And the words hung in the air like a toxic cloud that threatened to poison everything it touched. I felt my knees begin to buckle under the weight of what I was witnessing. The sheer audacity of the offer, the way it cut straight to the heart of every human ambition and desire for significance, the promise of power without suffering, victory without sacrifice, the crown without the cross. This was the shortcut that every human ruler had taken since the beginning of time. The willingness to compromise with evil in order to achieve earthly success. The bargain that promised everything while delivering only slavery to the very forces that promised liberation. I understood in that moment that this was not just about Jesus, but about every person who had ever faced the choice between the narrow path of righteousness and the broad road of compromise, between the difficult way of sacrifice and service and the easy way of self-advancement at any cost. The silence stretched between them like a bridge over an abyss, and I found myself holding my breath, terrified that even the Son of God might be tempted by such an overwhelming offer, that the weight of human suffering and the promise of instant relief might prove too much for anyone to resist. But then Jesus spoke, and his words thundered with authority that shook the very foundations of heaven and earth, commanding not just Satan but every force of darkness that had ever opposed the will of God. "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, 'Worship the Lord your God and serve him only.'" The earth itself seemed to tremble at the sound of his voice. Light blazed forth like the dawning of a new creation, and the darkness that had surrounded Satan began to retreat, as if it could not bear to remain in the presence of such pure and undiluted holiness. I watched as the great deceiver, the father of lies, the one who had never been refused anything by any son of Adam, fled from the presence of the Son of God like smoke before a hurricane, his power broken against the rock of absolute obedience to the will of the Father. In the silence that followed Satan's defeat and departure, I remained hidden among the rocks, my heart still pounding from what I had witnessed, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had just taken place in this desolate stretch of wilderness. The air began to shimmer again, but this time with warmth instead of cold, with light instead of darkness. And I watched in wonder as figures began to appear around Jesus, beings of such radiance and beauty that I had to shield my eyes from their glory. These were angels, messengers of the Most High God, coming to minister to the one who had just proven his absolute faithfulness to the Father's will, bringing comfort and nourishment to the human body that had endured 40 days of fasting and 3 rounds of temptation that would have broken any ordinary man. They moved with grace and purpose, attending to Jesus' physical needs while simultaneously radiating worship and adoration that filled the desert with music I felt more than heard, harmonies that seemed to echo from the throne room of heaven itself. I watched as they brought food and water, not the bread that Satan had tempted him to create from stones, but heavenly sustenance that restored not just physical strength but spiritual vitality, nourishment that came not from compromise with evil but from perfect obedience to the will of God. The contrast could not have been more stark between the darkness that had just fled and the light that now surrounded the victorious Son of God, between the false promises of the enemy and the faithful provision of the Father, between the shortcuts offered by Satan and the reward that came to those who endured temptation without wavering. As I watched this scene unfold, I began to understand that what I had witnessed was not just a personal victory for Jesus, but a cosmic turning point in the great war between good and evil. A demonstration that the power of darkness was not invincible, that there was one who could stand against every temptation and remain unshaken, untainted, undefeated. For the first time in human history, a son of Adam had faced the full fury of Satan's assault, and had not fallen, had not compromised, had not traded away his birthright for the temporary satisfaction of earthly comfort, spectacular proof, or worldly power. The implications of this victory began to dawn on me like the sunrise breaking over the mountains, casting light into corners of my understanding that had remained dark for my entire life. If Jesus could resist these temptations, if he could remain perfectly obedient to God even under the most extreme pressure, then perhaps there was hope for the rest of us who had failed so miserably at every similar test, who had given in to much smaller temptations with much less at stake. I realized that I was witnessing not just the defeat of evil, but the birth of a new possibility for humanity, the opening of a door that had been sealed shut since Adam and Eve chose disobedience in the Garden of Eden, the restoration of a relationship between God and man, that sin had broken but that perfect obedience could repair. The desert that had moments before felt oppressive and threatening now seemed transformed into a sanctuary, a place where heaven had touched earth and left everything different than it had been before. The very rocks seemed to pulse with new life. The sparse vegetation appeared more vivid and alive, and the harsh sunlight that had beat down mercilessly now felt like a warm embrace from a loving Father welcoming his victorious Son home. I watched as Jesus stood to his feet, strengthened by the angels, ministry but more importantly renewed by the satisfaction of having completed the first phase of the mission that had brought him to earth, having passed the tests that qualified him to be not just the Son of God but the representative of humanity before the throne of heaven. His face was radiant with joy and peace that transcended understanding, the look of someone who had stared into the abyss of temptation and had chosen the narrow path of righteousness regardless of the cost, who had proven that love for the Father was stronger than any appeal to self-interest or self-preservation. As the angels completed their ministry and began to fade from view, returning to whatever realm they had come from but leaving behind an atmosphere charged with divine presence and possibility, Jesus turned and began to walk back toward civilization, back toward the crowds that waited for him, back toward a ministry that would take him ultimately to a cross, where the victory won in this wilderness would be sealed with his own blood. I followed at a distance, no longer the same man who had left his village in search of answers to questions that had tormented my soul, but a witness to truths that would reshape my understanding of everything I thought I knew about God, about humanity, about the nature of good and evil, about what was possible when someone chose absolute obedience over personal comfort. The journey back felt like a pilgrimage in reverse, each step taking me away from the holy ground where I had seen the Son of God triumph over the Prince of Darkness, but also toward a world that desperately needed to hear the news that the kingdom of heaven had come near, that the power of evil was not absolute, that there was one who had overcome every temptation that had ever defeated the children of men. I knew that my life would never be the same, that I had been marked by what I had witnessed, that the ordinary concerns and fears that had once consumed my thoughts would now seem trivial in comparison to the cosmic truths I had been privileged to see. The village I would return to was the same collection of stone houses and dusty streets I had left behind, but I was returning as a different person, someone who had seen behind the veil that separates the visible world from the invisible realms where the real battles are fought and won.